This episode of the Orthodox Conundrum discusses sexual abuse and child sexual abuse material. Listener discretion is advised.
People who are rabbinic authorities are not trained in what it means to be trauma-informed. They're not trained in the intricacies of what it means to have a situation of grooming. They're not trained in understanding pedophiles or sexual abusers or people that abuse kids versus other adults, right? That's not part of their rabbinic ordination. And though there are some rabbinic ordination programs that have implemented some sort of dealing with the pastoral role, I mean, you're talking about significant issues and you are talking about significant abuses that permeate so many different aspects of who a person is. It's hard to kind of just wrap that up in a 1-hour conversation or a 1-hour training. And so I do think that there's a need to truly understand that in order for us to be able to fix it.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Sexual abuse is a problem everywhere, and the Orthodox community is no exception. While there unquestionably is more awareness of the problem today than there was in the past, there is still a long way to go before we can be proud of our record. One of the ongoing and very upsetting issues is when people in power cover up and downplay sexual abuse perpetrated by people whom they know. While there are those who do this for sinister or selfish reasons, many rabbis, doctors, and other people in positions of authority are acting out of ignorance rather than out of malice. They genuinely think that they're doing the right thing, and they don't realize the potentially traumatic consequences of their actions. Today I'll be speaking about this latter kind of cover-up and the parallel phenomenon of community leaders writing letters to judges on behalf of convicted sex offenders to request leniency in sentencing. These letters very often fully acknowledge the heinous crimes that the abuser perpetrated, but they also say the positive aspects of the abuser's life that they hope will be taken into consideration, whether it's charitable giving, minyan attendance, doing chesed for the community, or whatever other good qualities he has that, the writers hope, will potentially mitigate a harsh prison sentence. Again, these writers usually mean well and are trying to do the right thing, but they likely don't understand that they're doing something that is potentially very damaging in numerous ways. This is a difficult but very important topic, and I was honored to host attorney Rachel Bayar, victims advocate Asher Lowy, and psychologist Dr. Jeffrey Singer to discuss what's happening, why it matters, and what should be done about it moving forward. We'll get to that conversation momentarily. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rachel Bayar Esquire is the founder of the Bayar Group, a consultancy focused on abuse and harassment prevention. She is a former sex crimes and child abuse prosecutor with experience in both the public and private sector and is a widely renowned keynote speaker on abuse and harassment prevention. She partners with schools, camps, sports organizations, media companies, and many other entities worldwide to bring best practices on creating safe spaces into communities and workplaces. You can find her on Instagram at rachel.bayar or on LinkedIn sharing tips to create abuse-free spaces. Asher Lowy is an abuse survivor and director of Zaka, which raises awareness about child sexual abuse in the Orthodox Jewish community, advocates for legislative reforms, and operates a Shabbat and Yom Tov mental health peer support warm line. Dr. Jeffrey C. Singer is a forensic and clinical psychologist based in Parsippany, New Jersey, where he practices psychodynamically oriented psychotherapy with adults. Since 1995, he has treated between 400 to 450 sex offenders and completed about 1,600 forensic evaluations on sex offenders. Dr. Singer has served as an expert witness in sex offender-related matters, including community notification tiering, child sexual exploitation material cases, pre-sentence hearings, and involuntary civil commitment proceedings under sexually violent predator statuses. He has testified in approximately 325 court cases since 1999. He expects to make Aliyah next month. Asher Lowy, Rachel Bayar, and Dr. Jeff Singer, thank you very much for joining me on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you for having us.
I explained in my introduction what we're speaking about, but you are the expert, so I'll ask Asher actually to begin. Could you please outline the problem that we're dealing with today in a general sense, the problem of covering up sexual abuse?
So in general, in the Frum community, and I do always like to say at the outset that, this podcast is Orthodox Conundrum. We discuss the Orthodox community, but I want to make it clear to everybody listening that this is not a uniquely Orthodox problem. Anyone who's listening who's not Orthodox, who thinks that they're putter from this discussion because they're not Orthodox, you're not. All the themes that we discuss here today are applicable everywhere. We just happen to be discussing the specifics of what it looks like in the Orthodox community. So the specifics of cover up in the Orthodox community are such that survivors of sexual violence often find themselves without any kind of support, without any kind of help, without resources that they need, whether that's mental health, legal, material resources. They often also find that their abusers are supported in ways that they will never have access to. Their abusers are often supported in terms of being given a lawyer. There are many cases that we see where defendants are not wealthy to the point where they should be able to afford the lawyers that they have, and yet somehow the money always seems to be there to pay for their lawyers. There's support in the community to encourage people not to talk about the cases because of Lashon Hara. And I think what we're going to be discussing today is specifically the support shown to convicted abusers who are shown support during their sentencing, where members of the community, rabbis, doctors, people in positions of public trust are writing letters of support for abusers and showing public support for people who have abused people who themselves will never be able to have access to that sort of public support.
Okay, before we go further, I just want to understand better, why is that the case that the abusers get this public support, whereas those who are abused, you said, don't have access to it? What's the difference?
I wish I had a good answer for that. I wish I could tell you that there is a logical reason why. There are all sorts of reasons why the community doesn't like talking about the issue of sexual abuse. In particular, they don't like speaking about any sort of sexuality in general. I think the fact that the issue is so uncomfortable for the community creates a motivation to sort of try to minimize the issue, to try to pretend it doesn't exist, right? One clear example of this is over and over when the Haredi community, at least in America, reports on sexual abuse, in the few instances that they do, what they try to do is give the audience an impression that rates of false reporting are very high, so that this specific allegation that you're hearing, it may or may not be true. Keep a more open mind than you maybe should. There was one rabbi I was talking to in particular who is the rabbinic censor of an online Frum media outlet. And he told me that it was his belief that 28% of reports were false. And that's very, very much not true, right? And I asked him where he read that. We got to the bottom of it. I explained to him why it was wrong, but it revealed his motivations in trying to push that across. In saying basically, yeah, there's a problem that exists everywhere. It's a problem that doesn't escape us, but also you shouldn't assume that the problem is equal. You should maybe assume that this is a false report. Any individual case could be a false report. We shouldn't jump to conclusions. In general, there's discomfort dealing with that. There are elements of shame that the community has a hard time dealing with. There are issues like shidduchim, where the community prefers to not have that involved in a system that's very much based on reputation and by extension, shame as well. So I think it's much more comfortable for the community to pretend either that the issue doesn't exist, which is less common today. Most people are aware that the issue exists, or in specific cases, minimize it and try to ensure that people aren't emphasizing it, or in their view, overemphasizing it.
I'm going to move on to something which to some people might sound overly obvious, but I think it's important that we clarify it, because I'm sure there are many people who make this mistake or make false assumptions. Rachel, I'll ask you. Asher just said that this particular rabbi assumed or somehow thought that 28% of reports are false. And Asher said that is not true. That is very much not true. Could you explain why that's not true? Meaning, A person from the outside might say, of course, there are false reports. Someone can misunderstand what someone meant. I know that's not true, but can you explain why that is?
Well, I think in general, the idea that people will latch onto this notion that there are false allegations or that there are so many false allegations is kind of how we rationalize the cognitive dissonance to the fact that people have a really hard time comprehending or understanding that someone that they know from their community, from their shul, from wherever they are, would actually be the type of person who would engage in this kind of behavior. So I think first and foremost, we have a significant cognitive dissonance, the inability to truly understand that someone that you know, that you have a connection to, that you've had conversations with, that you've shared Shabbat meals, could actually have this duality about them and be that type of person. Right. So I think that that's the first piece. And I think that when we really understand how hard it is to understand cognitive dissonance, it becomes almost this defense mechanism to say, but there are so many false allegations, right? What we know about the number of, let's say, children that have been victimized by sexual abuse, right? Survivors or victims of child sexual abuse. The numbers that we have, and there's data that comes out of the CDC and there's data that comes out of other types of organizations, we know it's underreported. Right? Most people that are sexually abused don't actually report anything. And so when we look at the numbers that we do have and the data we do have, and it shifts based on the organization that you're looking at, somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 13 kids will be sexually abused by the time they turn 18. Sometimes you see 1 in 4 and 1 in 6, right? What we know is that the data is underreported. And so this notion of false allegations, right, when it really comes down to it, is that in order for someone to report, especially child sexual abuse, right? So we're talking about people that were victimized as kids, they are literally put through the ringer, not just by law enforcement, right? Even from a trauma-informed lens, having to be interviewed at a child advocacy center if you're in the United States, right? Having to be interviewed by law enforcement, by the district attorney's office. Again, if you're in the United States, it's different if you're in different locations. The idea of having a forensic interview done, the idea of having to relive those moments over and over and over again, potentially in a grand jury, potentially at trial, it is just the most trauma-inducing experience that actually probably exists aside from the actual crime. And so I think that a lot of people have this tendency to say, oh, well, there are so many false reports, not because they have data to rely on, not because there's information about it, but because it is easier for them to process this could be false, as opposed to being able to process this could be real.
Dr. Singer, would you like to add anything to that, to what Rachel just said right now?
Well, first, I'd just like to start by saying that what Rachel and Asher said, I'm on board with. And I just need to add that it's very difficult to have a rational conversation about this topic in general, because there are such broad populations of what it means to be a convicted sex offender. There are, without a doubt, though, our community, even if other communities have this issue going on, it is our responsibility to make it much more normal, if you will, for victims to be able to report and not have a community pressure from all sorts of leaders to not report. I've been in this field for about 30 years now, and I don't mind saying it's extraordinarily discouraging that it still could be 1995 and we're having this conversation. There's no doubt about that we need to be doing better about this. And at the same time, part of that is really using our definitions much more clearly in terms of not melding legal terms from psychiatric terms, because it's really hard to have a very informed conversation when we're using so many different terminology altogether.
Could you explain what you mean by that? What do you mean by separating the legal and psychiatric terminology?
Certainly. So a convicted sex offender is a legal status. A child molester is a legal status. A pedophile is somebody who suffers from a paraphilic disorder of pedophilia. And these terms have their nuances and subtleties that have profound implications in terms of management and things like that.
I want to take what you said, Dr. Singer, and go just a little bit further, because you mentioned that in some ways it's very discouraging. It could still be 1995 in terms of the way or the degree to which these crimes are reported. But I mean, in general, we do see now when it comes to certain types of sexual abuse, specifically of women, we talk about rape, for example, believe all victims. And I don't know in practice on a legal level if that's happening, but certainly culturally, it seems to be that things have moved forward. Is that not the case when it comes to child abuse and child sexual abuse? And is it specifically not the case in the Orthodox community?
I honestly don't know. But I do know that the communal backlash against victims should not be a thing. And I think that the phenomena that Rachel talked about, that imagine a community leader, a rabbi, for example, or anybody in the community that you spend a Shabbos meal with, is now stands accused of doing this kind of behavior. You don't want to believe that. It's really it's so discouraging, it's so disappointing, it's such a betrayal of trust that the initial reaction is it cannot be. But sadly, certainly, that number of 28% are false allegations. That's really not founded in any data that I'm aware of.
Okay, let's get to our main topic, which is about community leaders covering up sexual abuse. Asher, let me go back to you again. I'd like to ask, in what ways are they covering it up? Because I know you sent me a number of documents, which were very important for me to read. There are different ways that it happens. I guess I'll turn it over to you and you can mention some of them and then I'll comment.
So yeah, I do want to draw a distinction between covering up and what's going on when rabbis write sentencing recommendation letters, because these are two separate and distinct problems, right? And they dovetail with each other, but I think they need to be discussed somewhat separately. So the issue of cover up is that a lot of people who come to Zaka will report to us that they told such and such a rabbi or such and such a community leader, their shul rabbi, a Rosh Hashiva in the area that their family knows, somebody in a position of public authority, that they were abused and that the person told them something to prevent them from reporting it to the authorities, right? Either that's don't go to the police or don't testify if you're aware of this or something like that, or they encourage them to go through some other process like a based-in or something, but they do something to discourage them. That's on the lighter end, as advising them not to testify, right? On the more serious end, you get direct threats, right? People saying, if you report this, such and such is going to happen to your family. You're going to lose your place in school. You're going to lose your place in society. You could lose your home. You could lose your job. You could lose the hechsher off your restaurant. All of these things, right?
And this is coming from the community leaders, not the abuser, correct?
Right. I mean, the abuser is obviously often doing things to try to, mitigate the risk to themselves. So they may be reaching out to rabbanim that they know are close to the victim and trying to engage them to leverage their power against the victim to keep quiet. But yeah, in general, it's coming from rabbis in the community who in general don't feel that this is something that should be dealt with in public. Actually an interesting story, I don't remember what the context of this was, but there's a therapist in New York, a frum guy, who went around and got signatures from about 300 rabbis signing on to a statement saying that you should report abuse directly to the police. There's no reason to ask a rabbi for permission first. This was in direct contrast to a policy put out by Aguda that said that everybody should ask a rabbi before reporting to the police to establish if there's raglayim ledavar, right? And recently, after I believe after the whole Chaim Walder thing happened, he sent this letter around also, again, to try to get more signatures. And we at Zaka looked at this letter and we started actually looking at the names on the letter, and we recognized this rabbi signed his name onto it, but he told someone not to testify. This rabbi's on there, he told people not to go to police. This rabbi's on there, he intimidated someone who did go to the police, and so on and so on and so on. And we messaged the person who put the letter out and we said, like, this list needs updating if you want to keep putting out. And he stopped sending it around. right? So there are some cases where rabbis are fundamentally opposed to any sort of public dealing with this issue, any sort of using the public authorities, the secular authorities. And then there are a lot of rabbis also and community leaders who in general will support the reporting to police, but when it's somebody that's in their community or someone that they know or someone who's important, they'll make an exception, and that happens more often than not with a lot of these people.
Let me just follow up on that, Asher, for 1 second. Why would it
Yeah.
be that a rabbi would sign his name to this document, which was public, saying you must go to the police, but he himself doesn't agree with that? Is it possibly changed his mind with getting more knowledge that, oh, we really do have to? Because, for example, among the things that you sent me were some videos where rabbis actually apologize for previous behavior where they did the wrong thing. So we do know that people do change their minds and grow.
No, so first of all, it's the other way around. It's that they're regressing, they aren't growing. But also, I think the issue is that, which is a general issue with the topic of sexual violence. Sexual violence is an incredibly prevalent thing. It's epidemic, it's pandemic levels, right? There are more people who are affected by sexual violence than people who are affected by COVID, and yet we tend not to think about it as a public health emergency. Why? Because with COVID or any public health emergency like that, there is one external threat that is acting on everybody, and everybody recognizes that external threat and is able to push against it. With the issue of sexual violence, what you have instead are millions of individual cases. And in each individual case, there are people who say, well, obviously the problem exists, but in this case, it's not true because the victim is on drugs. In this case, it's not true because the victim is not SNEAS. In this case, it's not true because the victim is OTD. In this case, it's not true because of reason X, Y, or Z, right? So because these are individual cases that we're dealing with, getting back to the question you asked, there may be somebody who feels that in general, when they don't know any of the facts, right? In general, the proper thing to do is to go and report to police, right? But then they know the abuser. The abuser comes to them and says, I didn't do it. And this is someone who davens in their shul. And they know this person. Maybe they know the victim, and they also know that the victim is going through some sort of mental health struggle. And they for whatever reason, make a cheshbon that I believe him more than I believe this person. And also, I'm sure it's an uncomfortable topic to deal with. And rather than stick to a policy, which is if you have something to report, you go to the police and we're going to support you, right? What they say is, well, in this case, I know it's not true. So in this case, I'm going to say not to report to police. But every case is this case, right? Every case is an individual case. There's always stuff that affects someone personally in every one of these cases. And rabbis don't receive any training in how to recognize that flaw in themselves and mitigate it, right? So a lot of the times they in theory will believe the right thing, but when it comes time to actually do the right thing, there are reasons why they don't. And then obviously there are other rabbis who just fundamentally don't think that the public authorities should ever be involved in these cases, or don't believe that the problem exists.
Rachel?
I mean, I also think, and I recognize that this is a bit of a generalization, and I want to just acknowledge that this is a generalization. But I think there are a lot of times where people don't like messiness. And I don't mean messiness like a messy kitchen. I mean like emotional messiness, right? People in general, especially people that are communal leaders or that head up some aspect of a community, a lot of their purpose and a lot of what they do is they fix things, right? They give answers to things. Somebody comes with a question and they're supposed to be the one that gives an answer, right? The idea of like, you come with a shaila or you come with a shayla and I'm supposed to be able to fix this for you. I'm supposed to be able to give an answer for you. And if I can't fix it, right, I have to be able to outsource that to somebody who can fix it, right? And when we think about rabbinic authorities, no matter whether they are, communal leaders of large communities or small, there is an element of, I am the person that people come to in times of trauma, in times of things that are not good, right? I'm a fixer, and having things be messy makes it really, really complicated. And I think at a certain point, we also have to acknowledge that just like what Asher just said, and it was kind of at the tail end, but I want to draw attention to it again. People who are rabbinic authorities are not trained in what it means to be trauma informed. They're not trained in the intricacies of what it means to have a situation of grooming. They're not trained in understanding pedophiles or sexual abusers or people that abuse kids versus other adults, right? That's not part of their rabbinic ordination. And though there are some rabbinic ordination programs that have implemented some sort of dealing with the pastoral role, I mean, you're talking about significant issues and you are talking about significant abuses that permeate so many different aspects of who a person is. It's hard to kind of just wrap that up in a 1 hour conversation or a 1 hour training. And so I do think that there's a need to truly understand that in order for us to be able to fix it.
Asher mentioned two different types of cover-ups. One was covering up, the other one was more the sentencing issue. So Asher, can you continue and talk about the sentencing and requesting lenient sentencing by rabbis and doctors and others?
Yeah, so that issue is once the person is convicted, whether they pled guilty or whether they were convicted by a jury, the case will go to sentencing before a judge, where a judge will determine based on a variety of different factors what the appropriate sentence is in this case, right? So in these cases, very often offenders who are convicted will solicit letters from the community around them. These are meant to be character letters to give the judge a fuller picture of the person's life, of any mitigating factors, of any mitigating circumstances, of any reasons why the judge should offer leniency. And very often rabbis will write these letters for people who are convicted of some of the most heinous crimes. And in those letters say things, that minimize the crimes that this person was convicted of or pled guilty to, and then ask for leniency based on they were such a philanthropist, they were such a Baal Chesed, they were such a wonderful person. They have a family, they have a wife, they have children. You should go easy on him because there are a lot of people who are going to be affected and the community will be affected, and he's such a good person, right? And there are problems with these letters. There are often problems with the letters themselves. In other words, that they don't acknowledge the extent of the crimes committed by this abuser. But even without getting into that, the very fact of a rabbi writing a letter in support of a sexual abuser, while not providing that kind of support at all to survivors, and this is across the board. I have yet to run into a situation where I've been contacted by survivors after these rabbis have written letters and we've criticized them, telling me, actually, you don't know what you're talking about. This person consistently helps survivors more than even you do. And, that doesn't happen, right? What tends to happen is the rabbis who are writing these letters are people who fundamentally don't care about the issue, don't have time of day for survivors, don't do anything to ensure that survivors have access to therapy, have access to resources, are protected from backlash, understand that they're welcome to report to authorities without having to fear any of that backlash. The only time you ever see most of these rabbis speaking out in public about the issue is when they're writing a letter on behalf of a sexual abuser. So setting aside the contents of the letter itself, the problem is that when survivors see that, they see this rabbi was not willing to help me. They're not willing to help survivors. They're not willing to help put their name on anything public to make the community a safer place, but they are willing to do that when the well-being of an abuser is at stake.
Let me then clarify. I just want to make sure I understand properly. So are you saying that assuming the letter is honest and it acknowledges what the abuser did, but asks for leniency in sentencing, that inherently is not a problem? The problem is that same level of support is not offered to the abused? Or are you saying that the letter itself is also a problem, even if support were offered to the abused?
So that's a hypothetical that I often get when I have this conversation, whether online or in person. And I think the way I tend to view it is I'm willing to cross that bridge when we get to it. Meaning, in the event that we have a community where all the rabbis are on board with helping survivors and the resources are available and the support is there for survivors and everything is wonderful for survivors, right? And then rabbis want to come back and ask about writing letters. I'm willing to talk about it when that's a reality, but right now it's not. So I'm not going to address such a hypothetical. I'm saying that even if you have a yachid in such a rabbi who is such a rabbi, and I've yet to find them, right? That if they wrote a letter, it would still be hurtful because we live in a community where that's not the case. Now, it happens to be that these rabbis are not like that. I've never seen a letter from a rabbi who was showing public support for survivors and was doing everything he was supposed to, and also felt that he should write a letter. Most of the time, when we hear back from these rabbis, whether that's through back channels or the rabbis themselves when we talk to them, what we hear is, oh, well, we didn't know the full extent of what this person was accused of. We felt bad for their family. We felt that they, that he went through enough in the trial. It was such an ordeal. It was such a public busha that we felt he shouldn't sit in jail, or he should sit in jail for much less time. And the thing is, that concern is never shown to the survivors in any of these cases. No one considers their family, no one considers what they're going through, no one considers the impact on their family, no one considers the impact on their futures. Everybody is so concerned with the abuser and the well-being of the abuser and the abuser's family. And I do want to acknowledge that the abuser's family is often a victim in it as well. I don't believe to the same extent of the actual direct victim of the abuse, but still, they are collateral damage. And it's important to acknowledge that. But also, I believe the responsibility of that lies squarely at the feet of the person who committed the abuse. And if we're going to allow people to use the family of the abusers as sort of human shields to stand in between the abuser and any consequences, then we are creating a society that is fundamentally unsafe. It's unfortunate, you know, and I do feel sympathy for them, and I don't begrudge them getting support in private. But I think that when it comes to public statements, it's inappropriate for public leaders to be taking a stand publicly on one side and doing nothing on the other.
Dr. Singer, do you have anything to add to what Asher said in terms of the propriety of writing these letters?
Yes, that the imbalance that he's describing, that there's nothing for the victim, is really obviously a serious problem, that there's really no excuse to allow for that to continue. I just also want to point out, and I don't know if this fits, but we have a dictum of Ein apitropos lo-arayos, that Chazal, I believe it's in the Gemara, possibly, this is an area of my expertise, notes that when it comes to illicit, immoral, abusive sexual behavior, that nobody is without the potential for that to occur. And so when rabbis, stand in disbelief that could this have possibly happened, well, the Gemara clearly knew that it could happen, and therefore to have the reaction to push it away, really, I don't think is even halachically valid. But of course, I'm not a rabbi, and that's, I just think, important to keep it to remember.
Okay, thank you. Rachel, what's your feeling about the propriety of writing these letters? And I specifically refer to Asher's hypothetical. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the person writing the letter did indeed give enough attention to the victim and still writes a letter. Do you think there still is an inherent problem with writing this letter? Do you think there's inherently a problem with giving support to abusers in sentencing?
Yes.
Okay, why?
Well, I'm happy to expound on that.
Please do, yes.
And actually, I think it's important to hear me as a yes, period. That is the full sentence. For me, I actually think that there is an inherently problematic issue with it. And I want to be mindful that it's not something that's necessary. Right? It is not a necessary part of our justice system or the way that kind of justice is served or justice is sought for people to come out of the woodworks and need to support somebody who has been convicted. And again, I want to mention that I know that there are listeners from all over the world that are listening. So when I'm talking about the legal system, really for the most part, I'm talking about it in the United States. That's where I have practiced, right? There has been an entire process. There has been, in most cases, a jury of, citizens or peers that have essentially decided that beyond a reasonable doubt, someone has been proven guilty of the crimes that they were arrested for and that they were prosecuted for. And there's no need for character statements and asking for leniency to actually be provided, just like a victim doesn't need, or a survivor doesn't need to give a statement, a victim impact statement, but they have the option to do that. They have the opportunity to do that. I'm not equating the two, and I want to be really clear that I'm not. But I do think that's an important aspect of understanding where these character, memos come into play, right? It is really about trying to convince a judge, this person who has been convicted of this horrifically heinous crime, because of the fact that I, as a leader or as somebody that has known them, believe them to be a good person, their sentence should be less, right? And for me, and I come at this from a very particular lens, right? Being a trauma-informed prosecutor who was a sex crimes and child abuse prosecutor for a very long time, who has worked in this field for a very long time, the reality is that when leaders and when people within our community stand up and say, hey, this convicted person who has been convicted by a jury in most cases, sometimes by a judge, depending on the actual trial, deserves the time that I am giving to write something, to craft something, to submit something, to show this person should have a lenient sentence, what it's doing is it is yet again adding another layer of trauma for the person who was the victim of this individual. Right. And a lot of times when you have these character memos or these sentencing letters or however you want to describe them, right, people don't realize the impact. They say to themselves, well, I'm writing something down that's true, right? I'm not saying they didn't do it, they did it, but I am saying they did it and also they have been amazing working with kids. I mean, I've seen some really crazy ones, right? And also they give a lot of money. And also they are a part of our minyan and have been for many years. And also they're the first person to help bury someone who has no family to say Kaddish for them at a gravesite. These are all really wonderful things. And also is really a but. For any victim or survivor, seeing an and also is essentially the way that we would think of, yes, they did these terrible things, but they're really a good person, right? And so a lot of times the people writing them are thinking that they're just adding this context. And what they don't realize is that by writing this and adding this context, it is not only devaluing and minimizing, but it is also completely demoralizing for the person that had to survive that abuse or that assault, whether it was a one-time situation, whether it was a course of conduct, whatever it might be. And the reality is that that person wasn't there to save that victim or survivor in the moment. That person should step off and not actually participate in asking for leniency.
Okay, I know that Dr. Singer and Asher both want to say something, but first let me ask you, Rachel, because I know as a lawyer, you've seen many cases like this. Is it true, though, and I'm asking not, I suppose it's hypothetical, given that the United States legal system is broadly involved in such things as people giving letters to judges asking for lenient sentencing, that might be a very bad thing. In practice, that's often how it works. Would that mean that if one does not do that for this particular abuser, even if that's the right thing to do, ultimately you're going to give him maybe even a worse sentence than others would get? Meaning, is it fair that he's going to get a worse sentence than other abusers in comparison when everybody else is getting these letters that say this guy does all these wonderful things and this guy gets nothing? Does that mean ultimately the judge will throw the book at him in an even worse manner?
I mean, I don't know that I can make a sweeping statement, right? I really can't. What I can tell you is that there are many times when those sentencing letters actually work in the opposite. Like you think that it's going to create this dynamic where a judge says, oh, this person is so amazing. They have 40 people writing these memos. So therefore, instead of giving them 7 years, I'm going to give them 5.5 years. There are actually many times where it backfires, right? Where a judge is looking at this and is absolutely disgusted, right? You have somebody that sexually abused their own child, right? Or children, or recorded it on some sort of device. And actually, everybody, because again, courtrooms for the most part are open. And though you can't publish the name of a child victim, right? A newspaper can't publish their names. At least I believe in most jurisdictions in the United States, courtrooms are open, right? And court documents are there to be able to get. You can't publish them without redacting those names, but it's available and it's accessible. Like there have been numerous times where I have seen a judge, and I almost hesitate to say this because I don't want this to be the reason why people aren't writing those sentencing memos, but to identify it, there are many times when a judge will look at the amount of people that are sitting on the side of the defendant's, space in a courtroom that are writing these sentencing memos, and then will absolutely on the record just completely I guess the best word is completely blast the defendant's whole community, right? For the fact that there was quite literally recorded video footage of this defendant sexually abusing a child that was shown to a jury, and you're saying he showed up for minyan? Who cares, right? So there are times when it actually works in the opposite. And also, Because it's not an aspect of what what somebody's rights are when it comes to all of the different rights surrounding a trial, right? This is kind of like this additional piece. I really don't think that as a community, we should be thinking about this as it's our job to ensure that this defendant has, the best foot forward as opposed to that defendant who has no letters. Like, you're not a lawyer, right? You're not part of this process of seeking justice or defending from justice, or defending somebody as part of the course of justice. Like, it's not really for a layperson to opine on whether it would or it wouldn't, which is why I wouldn't make a sweeping statement about that.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Dr. Singer?
I have a slightly different view about whether rabbis should or shouldn't write a letter. First of all, if a rabbi does weigh in, they should really know what they're talking about. But more importantly is the idea that not all sex offenders are created equal. And what I mean by that is there's a distinct difference between a 21-year-old individual who has sex with a 16-year-old versus a 50-year-old man who's a serial child molester. And so I really think that the circumstance of the sex offense itself requires an analysis. And like I said before, the term sex offender covers an extraordinarily broad range of different illegal sexual behaviors, ranging from what we all think of, the vivid horribleness that we think of the term sex offender, ranging down to somebody who sends an inappropriate text message. So it really, really, I think, depends on the circumstance. And this isn't meant to take anything away from the pain that victims suffer. And I just think it's a very complicated issue that requires careful analysis at all ends.
I just want to respond to that last point by Dr. Singer. I think that as a clinician, I understand his perspective. I mean, I'm not a clinician; he's a clinician, right? So I understand his perspective as him being a clinician. As far as I'm concerned, though, my concerns have nothing to do with the treatment or rehabilitation of these people, right? I'm concerned about the risks to the community, and certainly there may be certain cases where you can view the risks differently. For example, if someone is convicted of public indecency because they urinated outside, and therefore somehow they find themselves on the sex offender registry, sure, we could have a conversation about what risk they pose to people in shul, right? But generally speaking, and I've been doing this for 12 years, I've never seen a case that falls within what Dr. Singer was describing, of where you may have someone who in the community winds up in court and is convicted and doesn't and shouldn't worry people about it. Like, I think there is a very big difference in terms of the clinical approach that somebody has to take about whether they are genuinely attracted to children, or whether it was a crime of opportunity, or whether there was something else motivating it, or whatever may be necessary to help this person to avoid offending in the future while there are other safeguards in place. But in terms of how we should be assessing risk as a community, for example, letting somebody who is convicted of a sex offense back into shul, these finer nuances don't matter. And all of these people should be considered a risk to children. If you have offended, you are a risk to children, because whose achrayus is it going to be on if this person offends in the future? I don't think Dr. Singer is willing to take responsibility for that. I'm not, and Rachel isn't, and no one should be. Right? There are certain things that you give up when you commit crimes like this, and one of them is being considered to be a regular member of the community. You represent a risk if you commit sexual violence. But getting back to the point I wanted to make, obviously the center of attention should be focused on the victims in any given case, because they're the ones who deserve to be centered in these conversations. In fact, one of the letters that we received a letter after we published Rabbi Moshe Weinberger's, we republished it from Amudim, Rabbi Moshe Weinberger's apology. We were contacted by the parents of one of the victims in the case that he wrote the letter for. And they made an excellent point, which is that everybody gets to see the offender in public and what they're going through in public. But the victims, especially if they're children, are anonymous. They're John and Jane Does. Everything that they're experiencing is happening in private. Their names are not public. They don't get to display their pain as publicly for their own protection, right? So when the community is focusing on this issue, they're only really seeing this drama play out from the perspective of the abuser, and they're asking and they're being asked to express sympathy from that perspective. But really, there's a victim there whose name is not John Doe, right, who has suffered and is going to continue to suffer while all this is going on. And it's important that we bear that in mind. That said, I do want to also point out this is not just an issue for the direct victims in a case. It's an issue for survivors in the community in general. To give an example from the case where Rabbi Moshe Weinberger apologized, what I'm about to say is not about Rabbi Moshe Weinberger. It's a different rabbi who wrote a letter in this case. But there are other survivors of other people who have contacted us when these letters get published, and they tell us, I can't believe that rabbi wrote a letter for this guy in public. When I was sexually abused, I went to that rabbi for help, and he turned me away with nothing. He didn't believe me, he didn't support me, he didn't give me anything. And now this guy comes to him after sexually abusing children, and he's able to get support. It's deeply hurtful to every survivor in the community. And I think that that's something that we need to start doing as a community in general, is centering the experience and thinking about it, centering the experiences of survivors, considering them when we take action as a community, when we set communal policy, right? Because that's not something that tends to happen. Survivors in the community often find their interests marginalized, right? You know, should this person be allowed to come to shul? We're going to ask everybody except the victims. We're going to ask everybody but other survivors in the shul if they're comfortable having a sex offender in shul, right? That's what tends to happen. And I'm sorry to bring up a very controversial topic, but you know, when we're already dealing with something so controversial. But another issue that comes up is like, are we going to have a Karlebach event in shul, right? Well, Shlomo Karlebach, he was an inspiration to many people. He also abused people, but also so many people are inspired by him. Why do we center one experience and not the other? Why does the spirituality of people who want Karlebach matter more than the victims in general, of Karlebach in particular, but in general also, who are going to be hurt by the public celebration of a sex offender? And before Dr. Singer feels the need to correct me, he was never convicted, but many reports have come out, and it is common knowledge at this point, you kick over a rock and there are many people. I don't mean to derail the conversation, but my point is that survivors are often an afterthought in the community. And when we're dealing with a problem that exists in such epidemic proportion, we can't afford to do that, because in any given room, if you have any given minyan, is probably going to have one or two people who experience some sort of sexual violence, you know? So we need to start thinking about that more as a community. We need to start thinking about how survivors are experiencing the actions of our leaders.
I want to get back to treatment, rehabilitation, and reintegration later, because I think it's important that we don't just let that go. But there are a few other points I'd like to reach first that are more directly on the topic we're talking about here. And they involve certain things which I don't know enough about. Rachel, perhaps you can help me out over here. In some of the material that Asher sent me, there are cases where, as far as I know, the person convicted was convicted of perhaps distributing, but certainly possessing child pornography. And if the issue is a matter of a victim, in this particular situation, again, I'm coming from a place of ignorance. When there's child pornography, it's obviously not victimless, but in terms of the shul, for example, presumably in most of these cases, it's not someone in the shul. And in that sense, is this the same kind of problem as someone who actively sexually abused somebody, or is it a different category where we can say, in that situation, perhaps sentencing letters on his behalf might not cause the same kind of pain because there isn't a victim who's going to see those letters?
Okay, so a couple of things in order to answer the question. And the first is, I'm going to answer this I'm going to answer this in a way that has the potential to be triggering for any survivors of sexual abuse. So I kind of want to give just for anybody that's listening, if at any point something that I say is triggering for you, like turn this off, right? Skip over what it is that I'm about to say. So the first thing is that we don't call it child pornography, although in most jurisdictions, the penal code still lists it as child pornography. The terminology that we tend to use is child sexual abuse material, what you might see as CSAM or CSAM, right? It's an acknowledgement of exactly what it is. People think about pornography in a very specific other way. So I'm going to refer to it as child sexual abuse material. I actually think that the question that you asked is really important to be able to dissect, because I mean this, I get this question a lot, and I appreciate that you asked it, and I just want to share that. But a lot of times people will say, look, you're dealing with child sexual abuse material. It's something on a computer. You're not dealing with a particular person that you know of. by the way, in your shul or in your community, right? So therefore, X, Y, and Z. And then you added, now, obviously, it's not a victimless crime, but it's different. And here's my answer to you. Tell me how that's different. And I say this as somebody that has prosecuted just a few child sexual abuse material cases, because most of the time those are federal in nature. There were a few cases that I dealt with on a state level, but I really want you to think about that question. You say to yourself, well, there isn't a live victim that you know of in the community, but there is a live victim. Right? Child sexual abuse material is only able to continue and to be accessed and to be downloaded and to be uploaded and to be seen because there was a child that was recorded or a photo was taken of them, and either it's video or it's a photo image. And not only is that going to live for forever, whether it's on the dark web, whether it's, in the mode that people who access this can access this, it's going to live for forever. There's no removing it. So as opposed to somebody who, and I'm not comparing the trauma is significant no matter what, but when you have somebody that was sexually abused in person, right, that incident then ended and the trauma probably continued. When you have somebody that's the victim of CSAM, that victimization is going to continue and continue and continue. I have spoken to people who were the victims of CSAM, or whose parents realized that their child had been the victim of somebody who had had child sexual abuse material, made out of their likeness or their recording. Every time they walk into a grocery store, they walk into college, they walk into an interview, they walk into someone's house, they have no idea if that person actually saw that or witnessed that, and there is no way to remove it. And what if it was your kid? Like, what if it was your kid? Would we be so quick to say, I mean, it's not victimless, but, right, it kind of is, right? Would we be so quick to say that if it was your kid, if it was my kid? Like, I can guarantee you from the few cases that I did deal with this, the fact that there is information that is out there, that worst moments of a kid's life is out there being perpetuated, having it done and looked at over and over and over again, there is not a part of it that is victimless. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that it's even worse when it comes to the victimization of that person who knows it will never be removed. And I also have to tell you this. Most people have not seen child sexual abuse material, right? Most people that are having these conversations or are listening to this podcast. As a prosecutor, when I was handed my first CSAM case, those cases are the ones that sit with you for forever. I could do a whole podcast episode on the types of cases that I prosecuted and what sticks with you and what doesn't, and really be able to delve into it. But here's the thing. When you have to hear someone's lived experience, you can only imagine what their lived experience was. When you ask them questions on the stand, when you do that forensic interview, you didn't live it, you didn't watch it, you're not there, right? There is a barrier that allows you to kind of do what you do, but also still keep a wall. When you have a CSAM case and you actually have to watch the videos and you have to see the moment where that happens over and over again, and then you have to show it to a defense attorney, and then you have to figure out how to show it to a grand jury or how to show it in court, when really there are a lot of complicating factors with actually showing that evidence and re-victimizing someone. Those images do not leave you. Like, they have never left me. They are seared in my mind in a way that no other case is, because then I was present. I had to watch it over and over again as part of prosecuting a case. So when we say that CSAM is different, for someone to watch that, for someone to consume that, for someone to get sexual pleasure or enjoyment from that, it is indescribable what it actually is like, unless you've been on the other end of actually being forced to watch it.
Okay, Dr. Singer?
Yes, I've been involved in a lot of CSAM cases in terms of evaluating the people who download this, primarily men, in fact, exclusively men, in my experience, and the vicarious traumatization of seeing this kind of material led me very early on in my career to not see this material for the very reasons that Rachel has described. And simultaneously, CSEM only offenders, as opposed to contact offenders, are a distinct, different category of sex offenders that have different management factors involved that are different than contact offenders. I just want to get back to the vicarious traumatization. There was a study on PTSD coming out of Israel about firefighters, and the ones who developed PTSD always looked at victims, the burn victims, more often, where the ones that didn't looked away. So, I mean, it's a real thing of vicarious traumatization and having to, live with that.
Dr. Singer, when you said that CSAM offenders and contact offenders are distinct groups, would you say in your clinical experience is the danger to children from the presence of that person who consumes CSAM, is it less acute, or is the danger very strong? We should consider it as if that person had actually physically abused a child.
Well, it's my impression that legally they look at it, the legal system looks at it the same way. Clinically, it's just different. And playing devil's advocate, I've downloaded many images of war crimes, of Holocaust images, and I have no urge whatsoever to kill anybody, let alone Jews. And I know I'm not going to act on that. And a lot of offenders of CSEM download child sexual abuse material and will not act on it.
From a clinical standpoint, you certainly have to look at it like that. And the law actually does look at it like that. They do treat contact and non-contact offenders differently. Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong, please, because I'm not a lawyer and you are. But from what I see in these cases, they do tend to treat them differently because we have a criminal system that needs to operate in a hierarchical way, right? We can't process what we can't penalize people based on the risk that they pose necessarily. We can't penalize people based on the effects on the victims. We have to penalize them based on the crimes that they committed. And we have to create a hierarchy for that, or we can't have a functioning legal system. We'd be giving the death penalty for everything, and you can't have a functioning justice system. But when it comes to how a community is supposed to respond to that, we do consider those factors. We do consider risk, and we do consider impact on victims, specifically the victims in a case and victims generally in the community. And when it comes to somebody who has quote unquote simply committed a non-contact offense such as downloading and distributing CSAM, I think Rachel, you're also a policy expert. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think from a policy standpoint, you do have to treat them the same way because you don't actually know whether they've offended or not. All you're confronted with, all the information you have in any criminal or civil case is the information that's presented to you by one plaintiff or one witness. You don't actually know what the totality of this person's offenses are. You don't know what the totality of their life is. You don't actually know the risk that they represent. And even people who are in treatment, and Dr. Singer, I'm sure you've read the same studies I'm about to talk about, but the efficacy of any sort of offender treatment tends to be measured highest, most effective when there is a threat of reincarceration and there's a monitoring program involved. Not every sex offender who comes out of prison and is undergoing supervised release is going to have that condition forever. The risks do change over the course of their life. So if you're a rabbi in a shul, right, or you're a principal of a school, or any of these situations, anyone actually, someone who's in a position to decide where children, who children are going to be around, and you have somebody who was convicted of a crime involving CSAM, you can't trust that person around children. It's not good enough to just say, oh, well, they never offended in person. Some of these people never will. Some of them will. If you're trying to create a community that's safe and you're trying to do that in a responsible way, you have to err on the side of caution of child safety. Right. And obviously, there's no way to ever guarantee child safety 100%, but you have to deal with risks as they arise. And someone who is sexually attracted to children or is interested in the sexuality of children or interested in engaging sexually with children or seeing children being sexually engaged with is not somebody who's safe to be around. Just to give one example, in 2019, there was a guy, Jonathan Skolnick, who pleaded guilty to blackmailing students. He posed as a student. When he taught at Yeshiva Flatbush, he was at SAR at the time of his arrest, and he impersonated students to get other students, minors, to send him sexual images of themselves, and then use those images that they sent him to leverage more out of them. And when he pleaded guilty and it came time for sentencing, thankfully SAR at that point had told its staff, if any of you write any letters for this guy, you're fired. I was very glad to hear that from his lawyer while I was sitting in the courtroom. But he tried using his autism as an excuse. He was diagnosed later in life. In fact, he was diagnosed in prison. I'm not going to get into whether that's true or convenient, but he claimed that as a defense that he was obsessed with the development of regular genitalia, regular male and female genitalia, because he had sexual dysfunction as an adult, and he was trying to understand how it develops normally in children. And he wrote this in his sentencing recommendation letter. He said it before the judge. His lawyer argued it, and the judge's response was I can understand that for the first photo that you asked. So you got them to send you their genitals, right? And you were able to examine them from a scientific standpoint. Why did you blackmail them to perform sexual acts on themselves? And then once you got that, why did you blackmail them again? Why did you keep doing that? Again, from a clinical standpoint, maybe you do have to focus on that to determine how best to treat them or how to categorize them within a clinical standpoint. But when you're determining policy on a communal level, that's not the same evaluation.
Most people don't realize this, but child sexual abuse material most of the time is handled as a federal crime. Right. Whereas when you're dealing with an incident of child sexual abuse, whether there are multiple victims or one victim or multiple incidents, or it's over a course of conduct, right, over a period of time, you're dealing with that on a local level. Right. So, a lot of times what people don't realize is that when you have a federal crime, the sentencing guidelines are much stricter for the most part. There could be some jurisdictions where that's not true. I'm not an expert in every jurisdiction, but for the most part, federal crimes are treated like it's not that they're more serious, it's that there is a very strict sentencing guideline, there is very little deviation. And so the question could actually be asked, like, people think of child sexual abuse material as a lesser than crime because, as you said, it's kind of like you don't know who that victim is. But really, when it comes to our legal system, we treat it as a federal crime, right? And a lot of it has to do with computers and phones and how things cross jurisdictional lines. But it's a federal crime for the majority of cases, right? The few that I dealt with were local cases where somebody recorded children and then kept it, not uploaded it, but kind of kept it on a particular device, and that device was found. So that was something that didn't end up going through the FBI or into the federal system in general.
Okay, I'd like to move forward about a different but related issue that Asher mentioned before. In speaking about some of the people who've received institutional support, Asher, one of them is an example of somebody who wasn't convicted, albeit on a technicality. I'm curious about all your positions when it comes to the idea of someone who is innocent until proven guilty and who was not actually proven guilty by the court, or at least not convicted by the court. This particular person was eventually convicted of something else, of falsifying other records. And Asher, you said, understandably, that this person should not receive institutional support. On the other hand, we're now not talking about somebody who actually was convicted as a guilty felon. So how do we make that distinction and say, well, I do believe the victim, but on the other hand, I have to allow the accused his day in court as well. And if he's not pronounced guilty, he has to have some rights.
So in that particular case, without using any names, because I want to keep this general, the issue was that he was arrested for allegedly sexually abusing a boy. And then the charges were dropped for procedural reasons. And then he was rearrested again when he used the transcript. He used a forged version of a transcript from the hearing that dismissed the charges to imply that the judge said that the charges were dismissed on merit and not for procedural grounds. He then took that document that was forged and gave it to leadership at his shul to try to con his way back into shul. Because the rabbi had made a determination after speaking with the family involved on the other end, the victims in the case. He had made a determination that this person should not be allowed into shul as much as he was otherwise before, meaning having a limited membership. And this person, being unsatisfied with that, tried conning his way back into shul with a forged copy of a transcript. So this is an extremely unusual case, right? And I think in this case, I think it's very important to note that this person was trying to con his way back into a shul that he'd been kicked out of because he had allegedly sexually abused the child. And the rabbi of that shul had made a determination for whatever reason. I haven't spoken to this rabbi. I don't have any firsthand information, but for whatever reason, the rabbi decided this person is a risk and is not welcome back into the shul because he poses a danger. And this person tried conning his way in despite that, right? So to me, that speaks to a connection. It's not like a case where this guy was accused of sexually abusing a child and that case was dismissed. And then, like, unrelatedly, he was accused of cheating on his taxes, right? This case that he was convicted of subsequently was directly related to the initial charges. And in such a case, when you're dealing with such a case, and this is, again, extremely rare. I've only seen this ever happen this one time. Because the two are connected, that's the reason why I felt it was inappropriate for any rabbis to be writing letters in this case. Because, again, you're dealing with a rabbi who has involved himself in the case and has made a decision based on the risks, right? And we know how rare that is in the community, that a rabbi will come out and basically say to a community, like, yeah, this person represents a risk, we're not allowing this person in shul. A lot of times rabbis are more willing to be more quote unquote understanding with these people. He came to that conclusion, right? So I believe it's a slap in the face, especially given some of the rabbis. There was, I'm not going to mention his position, but one of the rabbis who wrote the letter is in a position of trust, not only over his community, but over the modern Orthodox world in general. To come out and say, I support this person, right? I'm going to write a letter, to make a public statement like that. I'm going to be a character witness on behalf of this person, is a slap in the face to the rabbi of that shul who is actually involved in the case, who made a determination, is trying to stand by it, and is now seeing someone who is considered maybe his superior basically saying, I disagree with your decision. That's a slap in the face.
Okay, I'd like to ask Dr. Singer, what's your feeling about writing letters on behalf of people who have not necessarily been convicted? Asher's case perhaps being an exception, but in general, people who are accused and they have not been convicted of any crime, but there's reasonable suspicion. Do you think they deserve community support, or should they be dismissed, essentially?
I'm sorry for giving such a par of wishy-washy answer, but it really depends. I want to get back to the case that Asher spoke about and say kudos to the rabbi who made a determination that who are you going to believe, me or your cheating eyes, and that he used good common sense and had the backbone to do the right thing. And that's the kind of rabbis that we need to support. And really, each circumstance has its own merits, and each rabbi has their own skill set, and it's a thorny issue because you don't want to violate the experience of victims, and that's very important. It's very distressing. I really wasn't aware of just how underrepresented and underserved victims are in our communities. We have, every kind of chesed available for everybody, but not sexual abuse victims is very, very discouraging. It's really very demoralizing. I mean, temporarily anyway.
We're getting close to the conclusion. I would like to go back to that issue of reintegration and rehabilitation. It sounds like Asher's perspective is very much, and correct me if I'm wrong, Asher, but your perspective is much more, that's not our problem, or certainly it's not what you're worried about. You're a victim's advocate. Is there any room, however, for some sort of rehabilitation or reintegration in any way? I'm not looking to do good things for those who've done terrible crimes and terrible things. Does that mean practically that, for all intents and purposes, this offender's life as an Orthodox community member is completely over? Or is there something that can be done in some way for reintegration? Dr. Singer, let's start off with you.
Well, the question is, how far l'chutz lamachane do we put a person? It's clearly a very bad sign when somebody who's gone through the criminal justice system, convicted of a sexual crime, and then comes back to their community and says, "Hey, can I be the youth director?" That's obviously a very bad marker. However, for a lot of people convicted of sexual offenses, having served their term and coming back into the community, they're living amongst us anyway, whether we like it or not. And mitigating the risk to a community is a collaborative process that needs to be taken seriously. And there are certain communities that have minyanim that are primarily known for having older people or smaller minyanim, and maintaining a low profile away from victims can be very successful. It's very interesting to me. I've worked with a lot of Orthodox sex offenders. I don't know what a lot means, but sufficient to note that they lose everything from their family, their career, their children, their community. And when they finally do come back into and find a shul, they're able to handle all those things. But let's say after like 6 months of them finding a new community and a new minyan, the rabbi then finds out that they're a convicted sex offender and then tries to get them out. That's really when they really clinically fall apart quite substantially. And I find myself having to have a lot of contact with either shul boards or rabbanim themselves.
I mean, I think it would make sense. Again, we're generalizing, but I think it would make sense for somebody who's been convicted of a sex crime against an individual that they might fall apart if people are aware, if they know, if they've tried to reintegrate. And there is a place for them to navigate that in therapy with a licensed mental health professional working through the challenges that that poses to them. And yes, they are a human being and they should be in therapy. However, and this is a big however, to put them back into any communal place where they're, especially a child sex offender, where there are children, is, from my perspective, not only inappropriate, but the wrong thing to do. I would have no qualms about somebody providing a minyan for them to be able to daven in somebody's house where there are no children, where it is, a minimal amount of adult people, all of whom are aware and know that they are making this minyan for somebody that is a convicted sex offender. Somebody has a chiyuv, somebody has yurtzeit, somebody wants to daven 3 times a day. I mean, I could opine for a while on how from somebody actually is if they're a convicted sex offender, but that's a different conversation, right? So the reality is that if you want to provide a minyan in a very transparent way with only adults, 10 adults who are all aware, I wouldn't have any qualms with that. But the minute that you try to kind of create a dynamic where someone is able to come into shul, but only for certain times, right? Or they can come to certain things, but they can't come to Simchat Torah, or they can't come to Purim, right? When it's a balagan, the minute that you try to have some sort of limited access agreement or people that are going to watch someone, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because at the end of the day, what you have is a broken system where you can't watch someone 100% of the time. Not to mention the fact that we don't have phones on us in an Orthodox community, right? And so you're not in a position where if you're sick and you're the one who's supposed to watch that person and you can't get to shul, where you have the ability to let somebody know. And so at the end of the day, when we think about this, a lot of times people will say, look, they've served their time. They have the right to reintegrate. Don't they have the right to be a part of the community? And my answer is they may have served that time, but that is not connected to a right of reintegration. They lost the right to reintegrate to a community when they decided to take someone's life in their hands and destroy it. And it kind of, for me, is as simple as really being able to understand that statement. Nobody in the community is doing this to a convicted sex offender. They did this to themselves when they decided to take someone else's life and try to destroy it. These are the consequences of those actions. And we know that jail time and probation and parole are not going to work against recidivism, right? We know this. We know that jail time is punitive in nature. It is someone's going to go away for a period of time because they were found guilty in a court of law. And we also know, and I can say this as somebody who had many cases that pled out or that didn't go to trial, that somebody can plead guilty to a lesser crime and get less time or no time. And it doesn't mean that they're safe to be around kids or around adults, to be honest.
Okay, Asher?
Yeah, I want to start by saying that I think a fundamental piece of information that people don't have when they think about this question is a lot of people think about sex offenders as opportunists, right? They find themselves in a situation and they are placed next to a child and they're going to do what they're going to do, or they're not. They'll try to control themselves. At some point, they might find themselves an opportunity that they're not able to control themselves. That's not the case. They're not just opportunists. They create the opportunities themselves. They look for the opportunities and they look to create them. And when you try to appoint somebody to watch over a person like this, right? They're thinking they're a normal person. They're not a pedophile. They're not a sex offender. They're not someone who's looking to sexually abuse children. They're thinking about risk in terms of like, oh, well, if I don't let this person around children, then, directly in my view, they're not going to find themselves around children, and therefore they're not going to have the opportunity to offend. The person that they're guarding is thinking actively of how exactly they're going to get around the person watching them. So the person watching them and the person who's being watched are not thinking the same way. They're not acting the same way. They aren't approaching the situation the same way. The risk that one is anticipating is not the risk that actually exists. And I think that needs to be stated. And as Dr. Singer mentioned earlier, ein apotropos le arayas. We don't actually trust anyone to oversee someone who's interested in committing such an offense. I think that there's definitely always a risk. There's always a certain level of risk of abuse in any type of community. Someone living in a community is going to pose a certain risk, right? But there's a difference between the risk of them living in a community where their address is up on a sex offender registry and letting them into shul, right? And I think, in terms of finding a minyan that, I know this was the arrangement that they made with Baruch Lanner. They sent him to a minyan that was mostly old people, and it came out at some point that to the wider community that he was davening there, and it made people extremely uncomfortable. And most people wouldn't necessarily have a way to articulate why that makes them uncomfortable. But I could tell you from concrete cases that I've dealt with why it makes me uncomfortable, which is that people meet people in shul. You meet this older couple in shul who doesn't have children living in their home, but their grandchildren visit, right? And I can tell you that abuse cases have happened through that vector, that someone who was in shul met someone, or at some social event in the community met someone, got friendly with them, was invited to a Shabbos meal, and then the children were abused in that family. Am I saying it's going to happen all the time? No, but it's a risk that needs to be that needs to be considered, right? And in terms of rehabilitation and risk, I don't know if any treatments that are guaranteed, that the research shows is guaranteed, or at least to a high level of certainty, shown to be effective in preventing abuse and preventing recidivism. In general, I think people need to consider the fact that these statistics are difficult to measure anyway, right? A lot of it is relying on self-reporting or crime statistics. Crime statistics are relying on the people who are coming forward to the criminal justice system, and there's definitely under-reporting there. When you rely on self-reporting from the offenders, it's certainly inaccurate, right? So that's first of all. There really isn't any sort of treatment that Dr. Singer, you're welcome to disagree, would show that this person has gone through this treatment. I could say that this person is 99% likely not to offend again, right? And to me, when you're asking a community to balance the needs of someone who has come out of prison against the needs of the community, what you're saying is that there is an increased chance that this person might offend, but they're here, so they have certain rights. And therefore, you all have to subject your children to an increased risk of being sexually abused. I don't consider that an acceptable comparison. It's not our problem to worry about the needs of people who, as Rachel said, took the lives of somebody of a child into their own hands and destroyed them, right? When you go and decide to commit that act, you are signing yourself a warrant that you're excommunicated from the community, as you well should be, because you're a risk. It's not punitive. It's because you're a risk. And to Rachel's point about a piecemeal sort of policy about, you're going to allow them into shul unlimited. There was one case in particular that I spoke to the Rav of a shul, because we had gotten some concerned parents reaching out to us. They said this person is on trial for CSAM, actually, and they were told not to come to shul, but we've seen them at functions. We've seen them at functions connected to the school that's connected to the shul. What are we doing? And when I spoke to the rabbi, he said basically, yeah, we set a policy. We told the guards not to let him in, but he showed up anyway. And at that point, we weren't going to kick him out because his family was there. And then once he got in once, he kept coming back, and also some relative of his connected to the board, and on and on and on. When you don't have a strict policy about this sort of thing, there's always leeway taken. And at the end of the day, what we're concerned about is the safety of children. And these people pose a risk to children. Zehu.
Okay. Just to conclude, I want to mention that in some of the letters of apology, Asher, that you sent me, letters of apology or videos that were sent by certain rabbis who initially wrote on behalf of abusers for their sentencing to ask for leniency, and now they realized they'd made a mistake. A common theme, at least from what I saw, was that they didn't do proper due diligence before writing, saying, I didn't realize exactly what he was accused of, or I didn't realize how serious the charges were, or sometimes I simply didn't realize it was bad to do this particular thing, to write a letter on his behalf, and now I understand better. And frankly, kol hakavod to them for those who did write letters of apology, because that's very important. At least it's a big part of the step of trying to move forward in a better direction. I'd like to ask everybody to conclude, could you suggest what should be done by anybody who wants to say anything, defending or condemning, when it comes to CSAM or child sexual abuse of any sort? What does one have to do to make sure that you have enough information to opine whatsoever? Asher, let's start with you, and then Rachel, and then Dr. Singer.
So I think that there's two levels here, right? There's that they didn't know what was done, but also in a lot of these cases, what you'll hear, especially going back to the original case of letters, right? The big case that everybody kind of got their start in this issue was in 2012 when letters were written on behalf of Evan Zauder, who was convicted of attempting of luring a child for sexual abuse eventually in a superseding indictment. But the main body of it was CSAM, right? And there were people who were saying that rabbis, and even one person who's a self-proclaimed victims advocate, was saying, "Oh, it's not it's an otherwise victimless crime. It's not. There's no direct victim, right?" So, at the base, there's a lack of understanding on the part of these people often that needs to be corrected, because even if they didn't know the full extent of what Evan Zauder was pleading guilty to, the thing that they thought he was pleading guilty to was also bad enough that it should have prevented them from writing a letter. And the reason it wasn't was because they didn't fully understand the issue. So that's number one, is general ignorance. Number two is, I'll start this off by saying I don't think there's any circumstances under which any rabbis should be writing letters, regardless of whether they're fully informed about the charges or not. But to the extent that we're going to talk about that specific topic of them claiming ignorance, right? At the very least, I think they should read the indictment. They should read the complaint. They should read, like, we put out a lot of information about this, and I understand that. Actually, I know for a fact, I have confirmed that anybody who has like a tag or Mishim or any one of those like internet filters will block any content from Zaka. That itself is a problem. But in any event, if someone's approaching you and asking you to write a letter, you shouldn't. But also, if you want to look into it for your own edification, start by having them give you, or look for, because these things are always public, the criminal complaint. Look at the indictment. Maybe order a transcript of the arraignment. It'll contain a discussion of all the charges, right? At least inform yourself somewhat. And so far, every rabbi that I've ever spoken to or have back channeled with through somebody else and asked, like, have you read the indictment? Have you actually read any of the papers in this case? 100% of them have said no. And it's unconscionable that you would take such a public step on behalf of by that point, a convicted child abuser, without even doing the basic reading in the case. And a lot of these rabbis will come back and also tell us, oh, well, we didn't know it was going to be public because the defense attorney, who's trying to put on the best case for his client, is going to lie to everybody and tell them, oh, the letters are going to be sealed, no one's ever going to see them. We see them, we publish them. And in every case where we publish them, the rabbis are surprised that we're seeing them and publishing them, So at the very least, you shouldn't write a letter, but at the very least, if you're approached, just read the basic information about the case.
Thank you, Asher. Before moving forward to Rachel and Dr. Singer, let me remind you that I'm also speaking about letters that condemned the convicted offender or the accused offender, such as that which SAR did when it correctly said that anybody who writes letters on behalf of Jonathan Skolnick will be fired. I also want to know when an organization or person has the right to give an opinion about that on the negative side, on the side of saying this person is not okay. How much do you have to know before putting that out into the public?
I mean, I agree with everything that Asher said. People really don't understand that all the charging documents, like, they're accessible, right? You can actually pick it up. But I think that people are really don't realize that it's accessible to them. I also think that sometimes it's hard for people to pick up a legalese document, even though most complaints are not written in legalese, right? Especially criminal complaints. They are understandable. You can get a sense of what the crimes are based on what the jurisdiction is. But I know that that's a lot of legwork. I kind of feel like again, what Asher said, if you're going to do the time to write a letter, then you need to be able to take the time to figure out what the charges are and what they're actually being charged with. But I also think that just like Rebbeim spend time, I would say good Rebbeim will spend time consulting somebody when they don't have a particular expertise in a particular area. So spend the time consulting with someone that isn't the defense attorney for the person that's asking you to do this, right? There are plenty of times where I get calls from people asking questions like, should this person be allowed to come into my shul? Should I be writing a letter? Right? And I am not the only one. There are plenty of people here that have an expertise, that understand what trauma is, and can actually say to someone, tell me what the charges are. Tell me what the person actually pled guilty to, right? And if the answer is, I'm not 100% sure, then the response is, then you shouldn't even be asking a question, can this person do X, Y, and Z, or can I do X, Y, and Z? You need to figure that piece out, right? And I have worked with many excellent, ethical, wonderful defense attorneys, right? And I just want to be mindful that a really good ethical defense attorney is never going to lie to someone to get them to do something for their client. And so there is a piece of this where everybody listening should understand the court system is public, right? When you put a letter out there, it can absolutely be made public. It can be a part of the public record, just like the charging document is also public. So be mindful, do the research that you need to do, and also be aware of how this impacts your community and all the silent survivors and victims that are part of your community that you don't even know about.
Okay, thank you. Let's conclude with you, Dr. Singer.
Well, I think it's important for us to always question our assumptions. And I think as a community, what I've learned here is that we are really underserving victims, and it's necessary to start having victims support available in our communities.
Certainly so. And I want to couple that idea with what Rachel said earlier in our conversation, that too many rabbis simply do not have the training to know what to do in these scenarios. It doesn't mean there aren't any, but by and large, we need to have more training for leaders, rabbinic leaders and other leaders, to know what the protocols are should this take place. If somebody comes to them and says, I was abused, or if somebody comes to them and says, you are soon going to get a phone call about me claiming that I abused them and it's not true, I think that there should be a list of protocols. This is exactly what you do in these scenarios. You tell them to call the police, et cetera, so that people don't have to decide in the heat of the moment, how are they going to react to this? They need to be trained in that way. When I was doing rabbinic training a while ago in Israel, admittedly, which is different from the United States, we did do a lot about psychology. We did very little, or actually nothing, about sexual abuse. It's important that we include that in the training for our leadership. Now, I don't know, maybe in certain smicha or other leadership programs, this now is de rigueur and this is taking place, in which case, that's wonderful. If it's not, we have to make sure that it is included so that these mistakes can happen less and less frequently, and that at the very least, so that when leadership is approached, they can at least know, I don't know what to do, and seek help rather than making mistakes on the spot that could be very, very damaging. In any case, I appreciate all of you joining me today, Asher Lowy, Rachel Bayar, Dr. Jeffrey Singer. This has been very enlightening, even as it's been disturbing, and I appreciate your joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.